Stardust, check out the Stardust app. Look up the Eric Butts, use the link in the description below. Okay, I'm in vacation brain, but oh my god. Here we go. Oh, hold on, you know what, I'm gonna restart it, because I want to hear, I had my speakers muted because of work I was doing. Sorry about that, I'm gonna turn this puppy up. There we go, and let's do this.
We've passed on all we know.
Ooh.
1,000 generations live in you now. But this is your fight.
Be able to see it through the tears. Oh, it's gorgeous. Oh, what's your Kyle? No fucking way.
Be with you. No one's ever really gone.
What? No.
Did anyone seriously not see this coming? The pot has been simmering for years, and it was bound to boil over, and it looks like it may have. Now the media is going to run with this for months. Establishment politicians will utilize this event to justify any number of draconian laws and restrictions on speech, demonstration, and public gatherings. The violent right-winger boogeyman motif will be fashioned from this event and will haunt any effort of resistance to the system. There isn't much point in calling out the establishment's hypocrisy here. They gave a pass, if not openly endorsed, months of violent protests and riots in the name of Black Lives Matter. The protests were called peaceful, though there were clear acts of violence associated with them. The reason why the protests were called peaceful is because, in aggregate, the protests were in fact not violent, and thus it would be wrong to tarnish the whole of BLM's protest activity with the unjustifiable acts of a few. But that logic undermines BLM's own point. After all, most police encounters with blacks are non-violent, and very few encounters result in violence or death. So, if one is to defend the protests from charges of violence and maintain their peaceful designation by appealing to the aggregate, then the same should be applied to policing in America. But that obviously won't wash, because it doesn't fit the narrative of racist cops partaking in an open season on black men. These protests are at bottom about the original sin of slavery, as well as inequality, and the police powers that are used in their service, and so they get a pass. The protests and resultant riots were defended across the board, and even President-elect Joe Biden gave the violence cover by stating that Antifa is an idea. Even if we were to be charitable towards Biden's assessment and agree that Antifa is an idea, it is clearly a bad idea that, when acted upon, results in violence and destruction of lives and livelihoods. The damage has been clear, and the costs have been enormous, both in terms of money and in lives. Now, the storming of Capitol Hill has been deemed an insurrection or a coup, but both of these characterizations are misleading. An insurrection is a rising in arms or an open resistance against an established authority or governmental restraint, and a coup is an illegal, unconstitutional seizure of power by a political faction, military, or dictator. What was done was clearly illegal, but the protesters turned rioters were not armed, certainly not en masse. They had no demands, they made no demands, they never intended to seize power, they never seized power, and they had no leader. Even if Trump can be said to be the leader of this debacle, he never had the concentration, organizational shrewdness, let alone the ideological and philosophical coherence to lead a genuine coup. In fact, the mob intrusion into a governmental formality, which was swiftly dispersed by armed agents of the state, shows this. Shortly after the breach, Trump released a video to give his followers instructions. He didn't tell them to take Pence hostage. He didn't tell them to seize documents and ballots. He didn't tell them to hunt down and gather up senators. He didn't even tell them to disrupt the proceedings. He told them to go home. Furthermore, there were no organizations within the federal government that joined the mob on Trump's orders because he didn't issue any. The whole event never stood a chance of preventing the certification of Biden, let alone wresting power from the government. Still, there are many people in positions of power that would like for you to believe that this was a bona fide insurrection, and that the threat is real. Why? Because it will enable them to seize additional powers through the inflation of an alleged threat, which is always how they've done it. If you don't think so, just remember that you still have to take your shoes off at the airport post 9/11. CNN called the mob a MAGA terrorist insurrection, and the mainstream media, as well as progressive elements like Democracy Now!, are running with this evaluation, which they pass off as descriptive. This is nothing but deliberate catastrophizing, meant to whip up the maximum amount of hysteria. Only in the unhinged imaginations of hysterically motivated people, or in the minds of cynically, politically motivated people, was the storming of the Capitol an attempted coup. This language is only meant to promote a fantasy which will be used as justification for inflicting punishment on political enemies and destroying civil liberties. In fact, we're already seeing this in action. Top politicians from both the Republican and Democratic parties are calling this sedition and are bent on using the full extent of the law on those identified in that mob. All these hysterics are unwarranted, given that at no point was the American government in any risk of being overthrown. We're told by Chuck Schumer, for instance, that January 6th, 2021 will now live in infamy right alongside the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. James Stavridis, a retired U.S. Navy Supreme Allied Commander, took to Twitter and said that this is a 9/11 level event directed against democracy in our national history. Even a moment's reflection can show how bizarre, deranged, and unhinged these comparisons are. Even elected officials were tweeting out emotional notices, telling people that they were okay and that they had somehow made it out with their lives. This is made all the more odd because the only person upon whom lethal force was committed appears to have been a Trump-supporting woman who was shot in the throat by a Capitol Hill police officer. She died that day. Congress, in its formalities, was temporarily inconvenienced. Journalists and pundits and politicians all took to the airwaves to make condemnations of domestic terrorism, insurrection, and other such terms now being promoted by corporate media and woke capital. I have no doubt that all this will soon be used to make sure that this never happens again. I leave it up to you to guess what kind of measures will be used to ensure that outcome. But what we saw on Capitol Hill wasn't terrorism, an insurrection, or an attempted coup. What we saw was belligerence targeting the political apparatus and accoutrement of Capitol Hill. This event, however, has forced me to evaluate my stances on several issues. I was very critical of BLM protests and the tearing down of statues. I still am. However, I also find myself sympathetic to the people who stormed the Capitol. And a question I have is, why? Like Black Lives Matter, I think these people are motivated partially by good intentions and partially by falsehoods. They're also motivated by anger and resentment towards a system that they believe acts contrary to their interests. This is a combustive brew that has led to outbursts of anger, rage, frustration, and violence. Whereas I found the BLM protests unsympathetic, the storming of the Capitol found a spot for my sympathies. The so-called Stop the Steal rallies and those promoting them are nothing but grifting efforts by pundits and politicians, including Trump, who are feasting on the desperation of a large number of American citizens. These people in positions of influence and authority were, for months, spouting about how the election was stolen, how the American people were victims of one of the greatest shams to thwart American democracy, how their vote was stolen, and how the corrupt politicians in Washington were complicit, if not active, in the usurpation of the will of the people. One cannot spout such charges and expect those to hear it, to believe it, and yet stand down and behave. Such a dissonance rings hollow. To sit down and take it, when so much is at stake, is a corruption of one's own dignity, in that one is expected to internalize a command for both indignance and cowardice. I totally understand these feelings. The anger is intelligible to me, and the desire to fight is intelligible to me. That said, there's a lot to criticize here. There was some guy LARPing as a Norse shaman, others taking selfies with cops, some people stealing trinkets from offices and live streaming their escapades and the like. Worse so, they were supporting a man, Trump, who lied to them for the entirety of his tenure as a political figure. That said, I think there may be a silver lining in the organic energy that was on display. The energies demonstrated at the Capitol now show that the people on the right are willing to get physical. It's not just the left anymore. Additionally, despite some instances of vandalism and theft, as well as the tragic deaths of a few people, the Capitol was left unscathed. The efforts were targeting the politicians who reside in that space, not the space itself. I'll elaborate on this later, but I think it is telling. The right wing is often waiting for the moral time to get physical, while the left doesn't. If you doubt me, I recommend you reassess the violent interactions between the left and the right for the past year. The reason why the left needn't wait is because the left is in power, and thus those who participate on its behalf get the green light from their own authority. Meanwhile, any action taken by the right will be pounced upon and exploited for the left's own gain. We see this in the Rittenhouse shooting case, and we also see this in the myriad cases of Antifa beating up Trump supporters or journalists, or even those who are not sufficiently committed to their program. We can even see this in the James Field case. All of these instances have varying degrees of justifiability, and yet they are all treated the same, as opportunities to conjure up the specter of the hyper-violent right-wing menace, whilst conveniently ignoring the myriad instances of left-wing political violence. Though both sides are motivated by falsehoods, the left's falsities are backed up and propagated as fact by the establishment's consensus-generating institutions, like the mainstream media, the universities, and the techno-capitalistic elites who control social media. But what of Black Lives Matter? What of Antifa? After all, we've all seen the videos of various police shootings, from Floyd to Blake, to Aubrey, to Michael Brown, to Trayvon Martin. These instances of violence and loss can weigh heavy on people, and if people are already burdened with tragedy and feelings of disempowerment, then it is understandable that they'd lash out. The difference, I think, lies in the intent of these protesters and the objects of those intentions. Whereas Black Lives Matter and Antifa were largely indiscriminate in their attacks, the mob at the Capitol targeted the government, whereas the left attacked family-owned bars, small shops, as well as innocent citizens alongside police precincts. The right was able to storm the heart of their evil empire unarmed, and in doing so, cause the politicians who send American citizens to fight and die in foreign wars, and who vote to send billions of dollars overseas instead of into programs and services to benefit their own people, to hit the deck and to cower in fright. Whereas the left lashes out, the right aimed at a target. The right aimed at politicians in the seat of American power. I can only imagine what would have happened if Black Lives Matter and Antifa had stormed the building. They'd tear down the paintings, set fire to flags, spray paint statues, and overturn monuments. Whether or not they'd be shot up by cops is a counterfactual, the answer to which depends on one's political stripe. But there is no denying that the halls of the Capitol Hill will be far worse off had a left-wing mob traded places with the right-wing mob. As such, I think there's a world of difference between these two groups and the intent that motivates their actions, and I will not be lectured to by people who supported and gave succor to literal anarchists for the entire summer who managed to rack up billions of dollars of damage as well as overturned countless lives and livelihoods. The storming of the Capitol was a display against actual power. BLM rioted against a regime it hoped would help them, and that is why it was so easily co-opted by woke capital. But as I had said, there's a lot to criticize here. These folks who stormed the Capitol have to ditch Trump in the Republican Party. Perhaps the reaction to this event will wake people up to that fact. The energy is there, and so is the potential. However, the mob is misguided and misled. This isn't Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon, and this isn't even Napoleon's march to Moscow. This is, perhaps, just the beginning of a new phase of American politics. One thing that could happen, perhaps, is that so many people back away from the Republicans that the Democrats will win everything. It'd be akin to the Republican Party dissolving. This will make the U.S. a single-party state, which will, in turn, demonstrate in stark relief that the system of democracy and representation is a farce. This event may be indicative of what could be a fundamental shift in mentality for many. The government isn't your friend, and going along with the program isn't a way to achieve real change. I only hope that something actually beneficial can come out of action and sacrifice.